was just wonderful because I was in the last war, in the Second World War. Just brought tears to my eyes. Just terrific. The bands, everything, wonderful.
I mean, you think it was played down? Do you think the victory parade
was played down? Yes. It shouldn't have been played down, but it was played down. John Major didn't want to be accused of any prejudice, did he? But he shouldn't have been played down.
Or do you think he was afraid of being accused of electioneering?
Yes.
Which is why it's on a small scale.
If Maggie wouldn't have played it down, it would have been about 10 times bigger if Maggie had been Prime Minister.
Do you think the objectives of the war were achieved?
No, they were not achieved. They're both finished off.
We will have taught a dangerous dictator and any tyrant tempted to follow in his footsteps that the U.S. has a new credibility and that what we say goes and that there is no place for lawless aggression in the Persian Gulf and in this new world order that we seek to create.
The United Nations Security Council had unanimously condemned the invasion of Kuwait. But George Bush talks about the United States, not the United Nations, imposing its will. Where does the UN fit into his new world order? Since those days, we've become familiar with the UN's peacekeeping operations in difficult, dangerous, confused, and sometimes bungled situations. But the United Nations does other important work. Work with millions of refugees throughout the world. Work to help children. Work on the environment, on development, and on cultural programs. The UN is funded by contributions from its 183 member states. Some of the richest are in arrears, notably the United States, which owes over $800 million. This reflects the ambiguous attitude of successive US governments to the organization.
The United Nations Security Council has endorsed 12 resolutions to condemn Iraq's unprovoked invasion and occupation of Kuwait, implement tough economic sanctions to stop all trade in and out of Iraq, and authorize the use of force to compel Saddam to comply.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. Missile away!
An American cruise missile is aimed at Baghdad. It's not an individual act of war. It's on United Nations business. How did this all begin? Is this why the United Nations was founded?
We, the peoples of the United Nations, momentous opening words of the Great Charter for World Peace. At San Francisco, 200 men and women of 50 nations labored to build an organization that will outlaw war for all time.
The United Nations was set up after the war, just after the war, in order to free humanity from the scourge of war. And into the UN, an enormous amount of idealism and effort went. Here was a way of settling disputes peacefully.
If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
The UN consists of a Security Council and a General Assembly. The permanent members of the Security Council today are the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. They have the power of veto. Another 10 nations serve on the Security Council as temporary members. The General Assembly is less powerful. It can't, for instance, make decisions about threats to peace or the use of armed force. The General Assembly has been described in the Washington Post as a forum for frequently shrill anti-Western rhetoric. Some Assembly members are client states of the big powers and can be relied upon to support their policies. These client states were crucially important to the US in canvassing support for the war against Iraq.
United Nations is in really a critical situation. For many years, it's just been taken for granted as a talking shop between the haves and the have-nots. And it was the Gulf War really that put the UN on the map.
There were a number of issues at stake, but the principal one was that the West has a life and death strategic interest in making sure that nobody gets a monopoly control of its oil supplies.
The stuff that actually got the Allies going was not a story about oil. It was a story about a little country, not necessarily the world's nicest little country, but a little country being subjected to a smash and grab raid by a very, very nasty totalitarian regime.
There have been similar infractions of the United Nations Charter, aggression against independent states, on which the United States has done absolutely nothing at all. And, of course, the Arab world can't help contrasting the American action in the Gulf War with America's inaction over the Bosnian Muslims.
Our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein.
Smart men tapped their noses and said, well, this has nothing to do with the sovereignty of Kuwait. This is about oil. You take it from me, old boy. They showed a profound ignorance of Britain's part in the Middle East. We have a long-standing relationship with Kuwait. But equally, we have taken part in all the major international actions to stop oppression of small states by more powerful ones, starting, for example, with the South Koreans in 1950.
The Korean War was one the Americans needed to fight. Their aim was to protect the political and economic system they had set up in the Far East after World War II, of which South Korea was a key part. But they wanted the stamp of United Nations approval. They knew it would be difficult because of Russian opposition.
The Russians were absent. And the Americans carried a resolution through, and then, because the Russians hadn't agreed, they went to the General Assembly and they got a majority, and they hijacked the United Nations during the Korean War. And that did enormous damage to the reputation of the UN. And people said, well, that could never happen again. But it did happen again.
After the oil crisis of 1973, the US made contingency plans for a war in the Gulf. These were needed in 1990. Once again, they wanted UN approval. Resolution 678, the war resolution, was passed, with only Cuba and Yemen voting against it. The vote was the result of intense pressure by the United States.
At the time of the Gulf War, Russia was weak because of her own internal difficulties, was dependent on foreign economic support, and the Americans were able to bully and bribe, to put it bluntly.
And what happened to little Yemen? Because it had the courage to stand up and vote no on Resolution 678. The United States ambassador walked over to the Yemeni ambassador, and he said, that will be the most expensive vote you ever cast. That afternoon, all U.S. aid was cut off to Yemen. Nearly 1 million Yemenis were ordered to leave Saudi Arabia immediately. Get out of this country. Because of integrity in the United Nations, because your government voted its conscience and its belief, because you didn't submit to coercion and bribery, we have to make that a crime.
When the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the absolute end of the Cold War, within a few weeks, the United States invaded Panama. That was the first case of post-Cold War aggression, killed maybe 1,000 people, maybe more, reinstated a regime of the tiny, maybe 10% westernized elite of bankers and narco-traffickers. The country is now back to where it was, officially prospering, meaning the banks are doing fine, but poverty is increasing, unemployment's increasing, and so on. The next act of post-Cold War aggression was treated differently. That was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait.
In the 80s, Iraq had fought a long, costly, bloody war against Iran. For profit, and because Saddam Hussein was opposing an Islamic fundamentalist regime, he was armed and financed mainly by the Soviet Union and the West. Kuwait, like other Gulf states, feared Iran, so it advanced $32 billion to Saddam. When the Kuwaitis suddenly demanded repayment, tensions with Iraq increased.
There were historical reasons why this conflict had developed. Certainly, Iraq had a claim to access to the sea, which had been denied it. Certainly, the kind of colonial map that had been drawn rather casually by colonial powers was unworkable. The Kuwaitis were guilty of having pressed too soon for repayment of debts. Iraq was a country that had fought a long war against Iran, that had come out of that war exhausted and impoverished. The last thing it wanted to hear from a neighboring wealthy Arab state was, repay us our money quick.
The Iraqis thought that they were protecting the fat cats of the Gulf from the wrath of Iran, that it was really a bit much to be told, your currency, we will reduce it to the value of Kleenex. Given all the background, there was a strong argument for letting the Arabs sort it out themselves, and I still believe that had we done so, there would have been no Gulf War.
In the months preceding hostilities, various attempts were made, chiefly by Arab states, to persuade Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait. But these efforts came up against a stumbling block. To save face, he insisted on linking withdrawal with the Palestinian question. For the Americans, an Iraqi withdrawal became the nightmare scenario. They wanted war.
Britain and the United States feared that he was going to duplicate exactly what the U.S. had done in Panama. Their original concern was that he would impose a puppet regime, keep it in power with the Iraqi force, technically pull out, but then essentially dominate the country and its resources exactly as the U.S. had done in Panama. Incidentally, the scale of atrocities in the comparable period was also roughly the same.
The United Nations was powerless to do anything about the American invasion of Panama. A resolution condemning it was naturally vetoed by the United States. But Iraq was different. It now controlled 19% of the world's oil reserves. The Security Council decided to impose comprehensive economic sanctions on the aggressor. Iraq's oil is the source of its strength and wealth. If sanctions worked, it would become its weakness.
It's been a sort of a prime axiom of the United States during the period in which it's been the dominant world power that the oil resources of the Middle East, which are the cheapest and largest ones, must be under U.S. domination. Saudi Arabia, which is the main concern where most of the oil is simply an American client. The U.S. simply picked up the British framework, what the British Colonial Office called an Arab facade.
As the world's biggest debtor, and with only 10 years of domestic oil reserves, the US badly needed an Arab facade. There is in the US a growing sense of economic inferiority in relation to Japan and Europe.
American power is now visibly less than it was, and the problems are there. I mean, the inner cities, Los Angeles is now a city in a state of semi-civil war. People have a sense that we are not fulfilling the American dream. Very powerful image, the American dream. The American dream is that I better myself for me and my family, or if I can't do it, my children will do better. The sense that we're not doing that is going to slow down the sense of we must go out into the world and keep them straight and so forth.
This will not be another Vietnam. Never again will our armed forces be sent out to do a job with one hand tied behind their back.
In the case of confrontations with what they call much weaker enemies, namely the only kind you're willing to fight, the United States must not only defeat them, but must defeat them rapidly and decisively, because any delay will undercut political support, meaning political support for violent intervention is so thin that we have to fight only much weaker enemies after they're properly demonized.
When did Saddam Hussein become the Hitler of the Middle East? Did he become the Hitler before or after our ambassador met with him on July 25th as troops were massing on the border with Kuwait, and he outlines his long list of grievances with the Kuwaitis, to which our ambassador says, Mr. President, I'm here to assure you that we consider the problem on your border with Kuwait to be a matter of which we have no opinion.
I, of course, repeated our announcement and explained that we were a superpower and we intended to act like one.
Did he become the Hitler after we gave him hundreds of millions of dollars in credits through the Export-Import Bank to build up his military capability? Did he become the Hitler after we gave him the high technology transfers through third countries?
He owns anywhere from 10 to 20 million mines. We know he's got at least 10 million. We got pocket receipts on 14 million that he bought. Everybody was supplying him. He was our ally till August. We gave him a bunch of stuff. The Kuwaitis gave him money to go buy state-of-the-art. The Saudis gave him money to buy state-of-the-art.
$90 billion worth of arms were sold by the outside world to Saddam Hussein between 80 and the day the war broke out. The South Africans went on sending arms to Iraq right up to December that year, long after the invasion of Kuwait. And the British government, I think, above all, broke its own guidelines knowingly. And they did it all basically to make money.
There are large areas in the Falklands still fenced off because of these kind of mines. They're toe poppers. They're very effective. He was buying these in lots of 300,000 for $4.80. He bought up to 7 million of them.
During those years leading up to the invasion of Kuwait, we didn't have any evidence, or the international community didn't have any evidence, that Iraq was going to invade anywhere other than the fight with Iran over that border. Had we known, of course, he would never have had his weapons.
Sanctions had begun to bite. The Iraqi economy had contracted by 50%. There seemed little doubt that they would gravely hamper Saddam's war effort and force him to negotiate seriously.
You could either say to Saddam, that was a bad thing to do, so we'll blockade and sanction you, and watch him starve his own people, right? Because that's the realistic alternative to the use of force. Or you use the language that that man understands.
Sanctions, which now are said to be so important in relation to Bosnia as an alternative to war, were then thought no alternative at all. very, very interesting how these things are twisted from one episode to another. If it suits you, you say, oh yes, we must have sanctions and war is unthinkable. If that's not what you want, you say, well, sanctions won't work. It's a matter of manipulating public opinion. And there was enough which appeared to make it a just war. Not least the fact that I was saying that nobody is really going to get hurt, except Saddam Hussein and his army, and that's okay.
There is in the Charter of the United Nations a very clear provision about sanctions, and it's Article 41. And what you do in the UN is, first of all, apply all kinds of non-military activity, including economic sanctions, to delinquent countries. And this country was especially vulnerable because of the oil exports. You didn't need a military force to stop an oil tanker unloading in the Netherlands or something. You could have had a total oil embargo.
By the end of 1990, the pressure for war was increasing. The United States was becoming impatient. It had put together a coalition of 28 countries. There was a danger that the coalition would unravel, particularly since in some Arab countries there was growing political opposition.
There was a possibility of a diplomatic track, which opened very quickly, and there was the possibility of moving to the arena of force. And as I mentioned, the U.S. was insistent on blocking the diplomatic track for fear that it might succeed, and ensuring that the conflict would move quickly to the arena of force, in which, of course, the U.S. is overwhelmingly powerful.
We didn't see a war in the Gulf. Let's not mislead ourselves. We saw the systematic destruction of a people. They dropped more than 88,000 tons of bombs on the people there. That is the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima bombs. Better than 60% were dropped directly on civilian targets. And we know it. Anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. 1,000 baby bomblets, as they call them, and a bad rap for women, mother bomb. Each capable of sending out 700 razor-sharp pieces of shrapnel that will cut to shreds any flesh that they touch. Unlawful weapons used on cities. We saw the shells of them. Napalm, as was used in Vietnam. Burning people. Helpless soldiers, wounded, dying, or dead, buried alive in trenches by the thousands. U.S. total casualties, excluding accidents and friendly fire, fewer than 50 people.
Once again, the laser is fixed with surgical accuracy on its target. Once again, the bomb follows its ordained path. Mission accomplished, the aircraft leaves. The object, maximum damage, minimum civilian casualties.
Killed 7 persons.
7 people?
Seven people killed.
You know the people?
Yes, my neighbor. And جرحى شو نقول جرحى injured 18.
Are there any military vehicles, tanks, or anything like that? Any soldiers here?
No military here. You saw, no military. Only families. No police station even. Only families. You saw.
Well, we're very sorry.
My friend. Thank you.
And what about the precision bombing that we're hearing about?
Well, here's some evidence that you don't want that kind of surgery committed around where you live.
This is a discrimination war. This is a war between the North and the South. It's not a matter of liberating Kuwait. It's a matter of breaking the Iraqi people. It is a war that will have its effect within the next 500 years, so that nobody from the third world will try to say we are independent.
Most in the developing world were opposed to the war. The role of the United Nations in administering the conflict undermines its authority as an arbiter between the rich North and the poor South.
When we actually got there, nothing horrified me more than being at the sharp end of modern weapons. We were taken the first morning to the Amaria shelter. On the walls, now protected by glass, mothers holding their young children, carbonated, imprinted in the walls. I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas who laid down the conditions in theology for a just war. And one of St. Thomas's conditions for a just war was that everything possible should be done to avoid that war. Everything possible was not done. We never talked properly to the Iraqis. And if I may say so, the last people to deal properly with proud Arabs are Texan oil executives like Bush and Baker, impatient men.
The whole style of American military and political interventions in the world are based on two principles. A, we have to get back for Friday night, and B, none of our boys get shot. The world doesn't work like that. You smash in a 48-hour brilliant military campaign an odious regime, you allow it to escape. It is now persecuting people, it is now killing people, it is now torturing people, it is now threatening the Kurds again. And all because you're proceeding from a style of intervention which has the moral attention span of a 3-year-old.
After 5 weeks of bombing, Saddam Hussein agreed to withdraw from Kuwait on condition that there was a ceasefire. Bush, backed by Major, rejected the offer out of hand. The United Nations was not consulted. In fact, when the bombing began, they didn't even phone the UN Secretary-General, Pérez de Cuéllar, to tell him.
Where I think there was a gross abuse of the United Nations was the way in which the Americans ran the campaign without consulting the Security Council, didn't consult the Secretary General on some crucial negotiating matters, and in effect used their position as the only surviving superpower in the world to force countries which weren't taking part in the war to finance their efforts.
These men did not own the great oil wells they were forced to fight for. 6 families own 40% of the world's oil. Before they died, like the poor everywhere, they had dreams of the wealth of the West.
I think it was a job well done. The only thing I feel sorry about is that there was a touch of hesitancy by, let's say the Americans in particular, in deciding how far should we really push Saddam Hussein back. And I think it was a pity that he wasn't hit a lot harder in those decisive final 48 hours.
In addition to being fairly incompetent, they were thieves as well as murderers.
These were fleeing soldiers. These were soldiers who had been devastated, who didn't know what they were going to face on returning to their country. And their withdrawal had already begun, so it wasn't clear why they were shot, why they were burnt alive in the way they were. Yes, they did steal, but soldiers in all wars pillage and loot and steal. Somehow to suggest that because they stole radios and Barbie dolls and refrigerators, the value of their lives was less, and the crime against them was a fair crime, I think was a very worrying conclusion.
It was said that the Iraqis saw a paradise and decided to loot it. But it's impossible to build a consumer paradise alongside a poor country with a $60 billion foreign debt and expect peace and stability to last.
My name is Sardar. President Bush said the Allies have made a stand against aggression, and America and the world have kept their word. The Queen said the armed forces have done us proud. And the British Commander-General, Sir Peter de la Billière, named his American counterpart, General Stormy Norman Schwarzkopf, man of the match.
If you read the 19 charges that have been lodged against the military forces and their political leadership that destroyed Iraq, you'll find that the first two are crimes against peace. The victors must be held accountable for war crimes on the same footing with anyone else. From this time on, when war crimes are committed, whether by the weak or the powerful, the rich or the poor, they must be addressed.
The last official American estimate I saw of the military casualties was something between 75 and 120,000. But I do know that one of the demographers in the Bureau of the Census in the United States, who was asked by the government to estimate the civilian casualties, came up with a total figure of about 75,000, but she was sacked.
United States spokesmen, including Bush, had been fond of saying that their aim was to kick Saddam's ass, which was understood to mean his overthrow and, if possible, his physical elimination. This was not part of the UN resolutions. In this sense, the war was a failure.
I can remember one Friday afternoon we were watching television and they were starting to show the first pictures about the Kurdish people. And I can remember a little girl going up the side of this slippy slope and she had on wellies on her feet. And as this child was walking, the wellies came off and she just carried on walking. And he was trying to put her wellies on through the television, touching the telly and trying to put wellies back on her feet and crying and saying, I've done that, we've done it.
You could say that on purely cynical realpolitik argument, it was necessary not to completely eliminate Iraq and bring it to its knees because of the need to maintain the balance of power in the region. The Middle East is the one region of the world where it is necessary to maintain a true equipoise and not let any one power dominate it.
One of the results was reprisals by Saddam against the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. This led to a huge refugee problem. The United Nations Refugee Organization was hampered by lack of funds from the powers who financed the war.
Could it be that nobody wanted a democratic Iraq? Could it be that the idea of chaos in Iraq was too tremendous a political risk, and that it did suit the Western countries to have an Iraq that had been taught a lesson that would eventually come back into the international community with Saddam Hussein still in place?
But something nasty was also going on in Kuwait. The Al-Sabahs were back. The ruling family is immensely wealthy and profoundly undemocratic. Palestinians were soon subject to a reign of terror and expropriation. they were murdered and tortured on the pretext that they supported the Iraqis, the only linkage that occurred. But Kuwait had to be rebuilt. Lucrative contracts went to mainly American firms. The war proved to be very good for them and for the American economy.
If a corporation wants to advertise its wares, it hires a hall and shows them off to prospective buyers. If a state wants to advertise its wares, it hires the desert and shows off the great things that it can do, how it can blast cities and so on and so forth.
Victory in the desert was seen as a vindication of US technological prowess. Japan might make better consumer goods, but what counted most in the world was who makes the best weapons. The acquisition of high-tech weapons by third world countries is being used in the United States to justify a new military technological revolution. So instead of a peace dividend, there is a war dividend, with the prospect that future wars in the third world will be vastly more destructive. The US sold $336 million of arms to Somalia in the decade leading up to UN intervention. The UN is incapable of stopping this trade in arms.
One thing that pleased me very much about Bush immediately after the Gulf War is that he said he wanted to have international control over arms deliveries, particularly to the Middle East. He followed that up by selling Saudi Arabia, I think it was £20 billion worth of new weapons. He sold $500 million to Israel, a lot, I think $2 billion to Egypt, and all the other countries since have piled in. Alan Clark made a virtue of going to the arms fair in Dubai, I think only last year, to sell any arms that we could deliver.
You take a risk, whoever you sell them to, unless you sell them to sort of Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Finland, I mean, a few friendly countries that we can identify. You always take a risk that if it's an undemocratic regime, that it will turn nasty and turn against you. And you have to rate those risks subjectively and relate them to the prosperity of your own industry and the employment prospects in your own country. And I've made no secret of the fact that I usually lean in favor of the latter.
So Kuwait is being rebuilt. The Iraqis, on the other hand, are being prevented by UN sanctions from rebuilding their shattered services.
This is post office.
Water supply, sanitation, power, communications. US strategy was to reduce Iraq to a pre-industrial state.
3 small hotels.
Meanwhile, it is difficult for Iraq even to get the medical supplies and food which are expressly exempted by the UN resolution on sanctions.
Kwashiorkor has gone up 24 times. Marasmus, which is to do with malnutrition, has gone up 29 times. We saw with our own eyes not only babies in the act of expiring, but also cases of rickets. Now, I haven't seen rickets since childhood. Now these diseases are back, and disease knows no frontier. And the infant mortality situation is appalling, and the next generation will hate us for it.
Sanctions cannot be lifted until such time as the United Nations is satisfied that Iraq is no longer going to be aggressive and has put right what it has done wrong. It is true that Saddam Hussein will make the biggest capital he can out of sanctions and therefore will deprive his people of food in order to do that. Iraqis themselves are very nice, pleasant people, and they're in the hand of this dictator. Sanctions, I think, are unlikely to work very practically for some time. Sanctions wouldn't have worked, for instance, over Kuwait. It was necessary to use armed force.
Let us say together the Lord's Prayer.
So there is unanimity in the Security Council for sanctions to punish Iraq. This is maybe what Roosevelt meant when he talked about putting nations in quarantine under the threat of bombing. But does this add up to a new world order?
No new world order was created by President Bush. The Gulf War was fought for all kinds of reasons, but not for moral or long-term political ones. If there had been a new world order, then we would have seen a very quick solution to the Arab-Israeli problem. We would have seen intervention in the former Yugoslavia. We would have seen all kinds of things we haven't yet seen.
The Gulf War was a war for power over a natural resource that is of prime importance. The United States is economically weak but militarily powerful. Having bullied the United Nations into line, it was determined to have its Middle East war. Where does this leave the United Nations? As an organization founded to keep the peace of the world, it has failed. The United States has used it for its own ends and taken unilateral action as it pleased. The same tensions, the same tendency on the part of the United States to threaten unilateral action to solve a political problem have been evident in Somalia and Bosnia.
The UN certainly should be reformed, and let the UN and its General Assembly make judgments on issues like the Gulf War rather than the Security Council, which is manipulated, because had it been the UN as a whole, countries like the Yemen and Jordan and those who were nearest and knew most about it would have had their say, and indeed the client states of the Gulf and Saudi Arabia might have been much more careful if they'd had to take action against fellow Arabs in the context of the UN and be seen by their own people to take that action.
You notice that the United States insisted on keeping their own command in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and indeed in Somalia too. And I think until the United Nations has a force under its own command, there is not likely to be a new world order.
In the UN, the United States has a long record of voting either alone or with its client states against resolutions condemning aggression, annexation, and abuses of human rights and the environment.
As an Arab, I'd watched the United Nations defeated again and again and again by countless American vetoes in the Security Council against another very just cause, the Palestinian cause. And United Nations resolutions on Palestine had never been respected. No superpower had ever intervened to make sure that the international community saw that they were implemented.
The principle of permanent membership of the Security Council is being challenged as an anachronism. Why should it be perpetuated in a world which is completely different from 1945? Why should huge countries with huge populations like Brazil or India be excluded? With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is no longer any countervailing force to the United States. Could the United Nations allow an alliance of powers to form which would act as a new balance to stabilize the situation? Why should there not be a democratically answerable General Assembly, a genuine world parliament?
That would be my guess why they make one. There's at least probably 6.
The notion that the United Nations could be turned into a democratically accountable, democratically representative world government seems to me to be a bit of a pipe dream. It's a projection into a very long time hence. And for the moment, one has still got to think in terms of national units. I don't think it's going to be terribly long now before the question of who are the permanent members and the composition of the Council, of the Security Council, is going to be put into question. I think that's bound to arise, which is why Britain, among others, and French as well, are very, very reluctant to see this raised at all, because the minute it is raised, it will bring into question their own permanent membership.
The UN Charter and the sum of General Assembly declarations make up the only code of principles governing international law, but the veto is an exemption from the law. While the victors dictate all peace terms, while the militarily powerful police the world, there is no possibility of outlawing war and forcing aggressors to answer for their actions.
This institution that people of my generation had placed so much hope in, this institution created, as its preamble says, to end the scourge of war. We have to go there as the people of the planet and demand integrity and demand performance. And that means we have to abolish the Security Council.
You got the count? Got the count?
The new international order we want to see is an international order not based on brute force and threat. We want to have a new international order which reflects the aspirations of people to communicate, to cooperate, and exchange of ideas and exchange of cultures and enriching humanity from that. This is a new world order we seek to establish.
This new order is a utopian aspiration. It will be very hard to realize. A few nations, led by the US, want to control the wealth of the world. To this end, they are prepared to impose on us their own cynical and dangerous solutions.
Still we search the map for Palestine. It's fainter than it was before. With all those unmarked graves in Panama, still they talk of international law. Oh, go fix your resolutions. Yeah, go buy yourself some Egyptians. Go sell some Chinese students. Twist some arms, call it United Nations. Oh no, not in my name. Oh no, not in my name, you don't. Oh no, not in my name, you don't.
It has become intellectually respectable to say we can't establish connections between today's economic crises, the rift between North and South, the gulf between rich and poor in the advanced countries, and all wars, big and small, throughout the world.
Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage. Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage. South Africa and Namibia, nothing to do with this. Indonesia and East Timor, nothing to do with this. US in Panama, nothing to do with this. Israel in the West Bank, nothing to do with this. US in Grenada, nothing to do with this. Israel in the Gaza Strip, nothing to do with this. Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage. Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage. Selling Saddam arms, nothing to do with this. No democracy in Kuwait, nothing to do with this. Underwriting Israel, nothing to do with this. Oil company profits, nothing to do with this. Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage. Nothing is connected to anything. There is no linkage.
It's in the name of Bush, of Cheney, and Powell. It's in the name of Major, of Kinnock, and King. It's in the name of arms dealers, in the name of power. It's in the name of oil, and all the truth that it brings, but it ain't in my name. Oh no, not in my name.